Welcome, Baltic World. I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
This is Dangerous Policy. We talk about important issues facing life and society. Now, it's been a minute. Where have you been, Crispin? Where have we been?
Yeah, so for all of our Baltic viewers, I do apologise. We apologise for the long time between drinks. Something happened in Australia which blew up my life. I went to deposit some cash into my bank account, my own bank account. My accounts were then instantly frozen, and the bank wouldn't release my funds until I disclosed where the money came from. And in fact, it happened again later when I tried to withdraw cash and they wanted to know what the money was for. This was an outrageous trespass, and it created a media storm around the world. I shared it on Twitter/X. Millions of people viewed it. And then it went into the media space, it did all kinds of television interviews, and now a whole movement has erupted in Australia to guarantee consumer rights for banking. And this is because we have now moved to a largely cashless society. Cash is increasingly difficult to access and use, and a lot of people are upset about that for good reasons, but also the fact that banks are now trespassing on people's accounts in order to obtain intrusive information to which the banks are not entitled. There is a movement now to essentially create a consumer rights of banking that allows people to conduct their financial transactions without interference. And I have been at the centre of that storm. So because of this large political movement that has gathered in Australia, for which I'm now a part, it has caused a lot of other things to suffer, regrettably. But it's not because we've been idle and just holidaying the whole time. It's because something else major has happened. I'll leave links down below so you can catch up basically on what it's all about. But it has been amazing. It's an incredible kind of groundswell of support, millions of people. So in Australia, there are 4 major banks that pretty much dominate the entire financial sector. Some 90% of bank accounts are controlled by those 4. And they do things that are way beyond the pale. So for example, they will allow your accounts to be frozen, or they'll freeze your accounts if you conduct a transaction that they don't approve of. Not that it's illegal, not that it's causing some kind of money laundering or sponsoring of illegal activity, nothing like that. Just it supports something that they themselves don't like. And because of this, and because of the fact that we're now absolutely dependent on the banks, we are in a situation where there needs to be some pushback. There needs to be legislation to ensure that our own privacy, our own human rights are preserved and protected.
Yeah, I agree. And Australia is such a big country compared to the Baltic states. So a lot of people have been affected by their banks, particularly regional towns, where banks are removing physical branches, making Australians drive like hundreds of kilometres in order to see a bank teller and access their money. So there are other different sides of this as well.
There are many. So there's the privacy aspect, there's the access. And banks do this for multiple reasons. They do it for money, like actually,
cost-cutting.
handling cash, ATMs, counting money, bringing money in and out of circulation. All of that costs money for the banks. They prefer not to do it. But also they get huge volumes of data based on your individual transactions using digital technologies. They don't want to give that up. That's extremely valuable, both for their own information, for their AI algorithms, for providing products and services, predicting where individuals are going to go by comparing them to millions of others, creating new products and services to keep them attached to the bank, but also selling that information, hopefully in a de-identified way, to third parties, which they absolutely do. And then on top of that, there's the control aspect. They want to push their own political and ideological agenda, which they are not entitled to do. They don't have that mandate in our society, and it's purely because of technology and because of convenience that we have bequeathed to them this extraordinary power over our own individual lives, and it's necessary for us to collectively push back on that. So that's where I've been sort of a part of that story. There are many, many others involved, but purely by accident, I got a significant amount of social capital, political traction. It's now a topic that's hotly debated in the Parliament, and we will see where it goes. But that's obviously occupying a significant portion of my time.
Yeah. And you'll see in the story that when you get interviewed, they call you a professional poker player.
Yeah, they do. They were very generous with their titles, and I had a lot of sympathetic media in Australia. So I'll leave some links down below. But that's basically an update of where I've been personally, and that might actually take some time to come because I want to see that through to the end. So as a consequence of that, video production will be a bit more haphazard. There are things that we are committed to.
Yeah.
So for example...
So we've got the suicide video.
Yes.
And the history part 5.
Yeah.
That's been scripted. So
so the suicide, what we mean by suicide videos is, let's be clear about this for the YouTube algorithm.
Yeah.
We're looking at the regrettable suicide rates in the Baltic countries, and Lithuania in particular, and the causes of that and the best remediations for those trends, how to tackle that issue. And also the history of Lithuania series. So you would remember that part 4 was Lithuania while it was occupied in the Russian Empire. Part 5 will be coming out soon. A big part of that was, of course, the story of the Cashless trials, which kind of just popped up. That's a great video if you haven't seen it already. That's probably my favourite that we've ever done. I think it's a real
He keeps going on and on about that video.
I always will. It's a great contribution. So that's things that we're still doing. So the kind of legacy videos will be still creating, but the day-to-day kind of news updates of what's happening in that region, that's kind of taking a pause because they don't really have much playability. They just kind of are useful for that particular week or month, and then they kind of go off the boiler. Whereas the legacy videos like travel blogs and things like that, people can come back to again and again. So we'll still make those.
And honestly, the fact that you guys love my parents in the Baltic, like that pleases me so much. You have no idea how many messages I get from dad and mum saying, look at all the views we've gotten. So thank you for your support. Hopefully we have more travel plans like that. So there's that as well. But also I don't know if many people know, but we run another channel, which is for your poker. Called Poker Room Review. So for those interested, we'll leave that also down below, and there's tons of content there. If you want us to talk all about the social impact of poker, very random, but we are still around.
Yeah. So today, though, we do want to catch up on what's been happening in the Baltic region, and I think we should start with Ukraine because that's still the major thing that's happening across the world.
So Ukraine. Many people were hopeful with the counteroffensive, but now there seems to be a widespread perception that it actually hasn't achieved what it set out to. How do we properly analyse this?
Yeah, okay. Well, the bottom line is that that's true. If you were to put a list of desired objectives at the start of the counteroffensive, not all of those have been achieved. And not only that, there has been massive casualties on both sides from this counteroffensive. So based on that, you would say that there has been real problems. That said, first of all, it was crippled by high expectations. We had the massive rapid advancement in the Kherson Oblast a couple of months prior, where the entire Russian front in the region collapsed. But this is a very different situation. A lot of what is being targeted here is territory that Russia has occupied, not just since February of last year, but since 2014. And they've had all of that time to fortify the position. And in the last couple of months, for the first time in the war, the largest number of Ukrainian casualties was a result of mines. So that gives you an indication of what is actually happening. The Ukrainians are having to advance through serious defensive lines, which are heavily fortified. And if mines are your biggest threat, that tells you that you're advancing through territory that is well defended and not something that's simply retaking territory that was previously, briefly held by Russian forces. And in that sense, that's to be expected. You would expect progress to be extremely slow if you're trying to punch through heavily fortified positions, positions that would be a challenge even for the American armed forces, let alone the Ukrainians. At the same time, it's true that Russian tactics have improved. They've learned some lessons from their early mistakes. There was a case where a number of columns of armour were funneled into positions that were advancing towards Russian positions that were then destroyed. So it's clear the Russians have improved their defensive tactics. And also there are criticisms of Ukraine's combined arms capability, the ability to coordinate their infantry advances with artillery strikes and how to use advanced armour effectively. And so it's easy to overstate those criticisms because think about what they're trying to do. They're having to go and beat the Russian army in the field where the Russians are in the defence and they have all the strategic advantages. So for all of those reasons, one can say, look, any advance at all, the fact that they're fighting on essentially Russian-held territory rather than Ukrainian-held territory, shows just how far things have come since the start of the war in Ukraine. And the fact that any advances are being made at all is a great achievement. Add to that the fact that the Netherlands is donating over 60 F-16s to Ukraine. Ukraine will be able to challenge Russian air supremacy for the first time since the start of the war. And if these things can continue to be adapted to and improved, then I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't a major Ukrainian breakthrough in the next kind of 4 to 6 months. That said, it is true that if the counteroffensive objectives were being held against the outcome, clearly the advances have not been as successful and as widespread as one would have hoped, and the casualties have been much higher. And that, I think, does have strategic implications. One of those strategic implications is the victory conditions as accepted not by the Ukrainians but by the United States and Britain, major supporting players of Ukraine. Because they're not the same as Ukraine themselves. Ukraine's victory condition is to throw Russia completely out of Ukrainian territory, see that Vladimir Putin is brought to The Hague for war crimes, reparations paid by the Russian state for all the damage and destruction wrought upon the Ukrainian people, and all of that is entirely reasonable. Whereas the victory condition for the Americans, deep down, despite what they say publicly, they were in it for the long haul. There was Biden's speech that he gave in Vilnius, which was just like, we're never taking a backward step. But the reality is not quite that simple. America's victory condition is for Russia's invasion force to be withdrawn. That is, the territory that was already held by pro-Russian forces between 2014 and 2022, that can remain under kind of American conditions. They just want the invading forces out, and for Ukraine to be pro-Western. And that's a different victory condition. That's not punishing Russia for its aggression. That's not overthrowing Vladimir Putin. It's not.
Why is that their victory condition? Like, why isn't it throwing the Russians out?
Because at the end of the day, Ukraine is not a core strategic interest of the United States. They care about NATO and NATO's integrity, and they feared that if Ukraine was to fall, then NATO would be next, the Baltic countries would be next, Poland would be next. Reasonable anxiety to have. But they also want to not just win the war, they want to win the peace. They want to have a peace after the war where it suits American strategic interests. And an example of that might be Korea is a good example, where you have a petition across the 38th parallel that still hasn't been resolved. I mean, from a Korean point of view, it's totally unsatisfactory. You've got the entire peninsula is divided into two. It's been divided for generations now with absolute chasms between the two sides. They will never be able to reunify in a sort of peaceful and cohesive way. But American interests have been satisfied with that outcome. They've got a staunch ally on the peninsula. They have a permanent military presence there. Seoul remains liberated. And if they look at that and apply that to Ukraine, as long as the majority of the Ukrainian state is has its integrity, that the Russians have not been successful in their strategic aims to overthrow the government and install a new constitution, and that a free Ukraine can be brought into NATO, can be brought into the EU, where there is a sort of peace treaty in place with the Russians, then that is an outcome that the Americans will live with. And if the counteroffensive that the Ukrainians have continues to stall, those voices will get louder in America. That there will be a point at which people will call this a stalemate, and once you have a stalemate, they'll call for an end to the bloodshed. That's what happened in Korea, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's what happens in Ukraine.
Would it happen this year?
This year is probably a bit too early.
Okay.
I think that the F-16s that are being given to Ukraine will need to have their effect. There's a lot of training. There's several brigade-level forces that are being trained outside of the country, outside of Ukraine, that are yet to return to the fight. There will be a lot of lessons learned and incorporated into how to do combined arms offensives. And so there'll probably be another major offensive before we get to what is probably called a stalemate. In other words, the Ukrainians will have more opportunities to make significant gains against Russian forces. And if they are seen to be winners, if they're seen to be able to put the Russians on the run and capture territory that Russians have held for many years, then they will continue to be supported. I mean, that's the sort of level. I mean, at first, it was, can Ukraine hold its core cities, its core territory? Absolutely proved able to do that. And then it's like, can they beat the Russians, though, and push them back from territory that they've since captured? And the Kherson counteroffensive proved that in spades. I mean, the Russian front completely collapsed. But then the next test is, can the Ukrainians beat the Russian armed forces in the field in areas where Russians have controlled that territory for many years and fortified it through multiple defensive lines. And so far, the Ukrainians have had real difficulty punching through those lines. So that's the next tier of ongoing support. If the Ukrainians can do that, as I said, there will be several more opportunities for them to be able to demonstrate that ability. They'll get the technology that they need in order to try and achieve that outcome. But it requires a lot more skill on the part of the Ukrainian logistics and also the technology to be provided by the West, and then also hopefully some Russian mistakes. If that happens, then Ukraine will be able to receive the support it needs to finish the war entirely on its terms. But if not, if it's more like what we're seeing, then there'll be increasing voices in the West trying to get the Ukrainians to compromise.
Okay. That's fair. And then with the recent death of the Wagner leader, Prigozhin, does that have any other implications? I don't even think he's dead, to be honest. I think it's a conspiracy, but...
Well, we won't know for a long time. I mean, of course, the news article just out is that he died in a plane crash along with 10 others. And it's entirely possible that that's the case. I would have found it incredibly unlikely for him to live for a long period of time, having tried to publicly and openly rise up against Vladimir Putin, only to abort that uprising. I mean, if you think about the generals that tried to rise up against the emperors of Rome, well, you were either successful or you were killed. And I think the same is true for the Russian state. I would be deeply surprised if Prigozhin was allowed to continue to be at liberty after having pulled back. Whether or not he is actually dead, it's a good question, because he dies in a plane crash. They may never recover the body.
Yeah, there's a lot of footage as well. A lot of footage of said plane crash.
Yeah, it's very convenient.
It is very convenient that people had their phones out at that particular time and recognised that was the plane.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a lot of media spectacle around it. So it might be one of several possibilities. Either he died in a plane crash, he could have been arrested and they faked his death so that they could keep control of the Wagner group, because they might have been fearful that had they publicly arrested Prigozhin, the Wagner group may have become restless and rebellious once more. But if he was killed in a plane crash, well, there's no point them kind of rebelling. Or he could have made a deal with Putin and be like, okay, you can be alive, but you have to disappear and you have to, we'll consider you dead. And if you ever pop up again, we're going to finish you off. So it's an interesting situation, but I don't think it changes any of the dynamic.
Man, I just wanted an uprising to happen. That was the craziest 24 hours in my life.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be an uprising in Russia. I think they've been exceptionally skilled at controlling the narrative in Russia and making sure that the effects of the war are minimally impacting Moscow and St. Petersburg.
How do they even do that? Do they just have like routes with China and...
Well, there's multiple aspects. One of it's the economic aspect, yes. So they have the trade with China, with India. They find other markets for their goods. They prop up the ruble as best they can, although that's been limited success. But also in terms of the casualties, the Russian casualties have been extremely high, but they haven't been evenly distributed. Yeah, the probability of dying in the war if you're from Moscow or St. Petersburg is something like 100 times less than in the eastern provinces. And that's because recruiters are going out to those provinces to round up as many people as possible, getting them to sign up and fight in Ukraine. And then if something happens to them, well, it's not politically salient. It's not affecting the Slavs of Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's affecting the minorities of Siberia. And while many of those are signing up because of economic reasons, the contracts that they're being offered by their local living standards are absolutely crazy, like something like 10 times the local salary. So they will attract people, but it also means that, the death tolls can be concealed and are out of sight and out of mind of the places which are politically most volatile for the regime. So Putin, as long as he controls Moscow and St. Petersburg, he controls Russia.
I see. So I was on Lithuanian Reddit and I saw that percentage change of average annual wages have gone up quite significantly in the Baltic.
Right.
Between 1990 and 2020. So Lithuania looks like it's 276.3%. Latvia is 200% and Estonia is 237%. Where are we at with inflation? Like, is this enough?
Well, that's a really good point. Yes, wages have dramatically increased in the Baltic since that time, but there are two things to consider. One is the effect of the euro, which massively drove up inflation. And if you think about Lithuania in particular, it was previously on the litre, so wages were much smaller. And while that's the case, its exports were also significantly greater. So if you had a cheap currency, that makes your exports more competitive in the marketplace. So if you're selling cheese or dairy products or even tourism, if you're a cheap destination, then more people are going to visit, more people are going to spend money. That's good for your hospitality sector. It's good for your hotel sector.
Yes.
And when the Baltic countries joined the EU and they adopted the euro, well, everything went up dramatically in price because they were using the euro. But it also meant that wages increased because they were being paid in euros. So that was the first increase. It wasn't really a product of sort of legislation or demand increasing wages. And there was a massive exodus of young people from those countries. The population of Lithuania went down by almost a third, disproportionately their younger population, which I think has been an absolute travesty for all of the Baltic countries. And I think their number one priority should remain, from a public policy perspective, is attracting those young people back. And there are certain things that are happening in that regard, but nowhere near enough. And so, yes, wages have increased. And now, more recently, inflation in the Baltic countries was last year running double that of the EU average, which was already running pretty high. And these countries have legislated minimum wage increases to try and combat that, which is good. You want to make sure that your wages, to the greatest extent possible, can keep up with inflation. But the drawback to that is it makes your business far less competitive, because the businesses are not only are they paying huge sums of money from inflation for their energy costs, for their production costs and their freight and so on, but they're also paying high labour costs. And perhaps their biggest competitive advantage in the Baltic countries was their low labour costs, driving a lot of that business and investment elsewhere.
Well, because they just don't have the population. I know many young people in Lithuania, in the Baltic broadly, are just moving to places like Germany, where they get 3 times greater wages
Yeah,
to do the same job.
Definitely. And this is a disaster. And I think it's the biggest drawback of the Baltic countries being in the EU and being on the euro. Now, I don't actually think it's a problem necessarily when it's purely temporary. It's a good thing for people to be able to travel to other countries and earn a lot more money and then bring that money back and invest it locally in their home communities. That's actually a really good dividend. And remittances, when people are working abroad and sending money home, is also a really good way to boost the local economy. You travel to places that have a labour shortage, that are paying high wages, and then you spend that money and boost consumer demand in your home country rather than the adopted country. The problem is that this is not proving as temporary as I would like. The Baltic countries really do need to find ways to attract people home. One of the things that this channel does, I like to think, is encourage young people from the Baltic who are living in other parts of the world to think about all the amazing things about the Baltic, the extraordinary history, the unique culture, the amazing landscapes, and the tremendous potential of these countries to become, powerhouse machines. And one of the great myths that you would dispel about these countries is that they're somehow behind, somehow backwater. The fact is that Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, they all have bleeding edge tech sectors. They are absolutely first world in all of their infrastructure and technology and so forth. And the Baltic leadership needs to actually showcase that more. And to an extent they are. They've come to produce trade strategies with the entire Asian region, look at beyond just the EU and find new partners elsewhere. Of course, the relationship between Lithuania and Taiwan is deepening all the time, and Taiwan is investing in superconductors in Lithuania. So there are things happening. The Rail Baltica project, which is going to create a high-speed rail system between Tallinn all the way, I think, down to Warsaw, is a great initiative that will massively expand the opportunities for people to repatriate to their own towns and villages where they couldn't actually find work locally, but they can easily find work if they travel to a major city, which becomes a major hub. If they can do that as a commute, then that will be more attractive. And so I actually quite like the route that the Rail Baltica is taking. I've noted that in the news there's some issues about the disruption it's having to where the path is going through. Some people are going to lose their homes. There's going to be some issues around that and make sure they're properly compensated. But overall, the project, I hope, will be a success because that will be very attractive, not only for the actual locals, but also for visitors, being able to go and become tourists going the entire length of the Baltic states in a short period of time. That'll create a whole new class of tourists going to those countries, people that don't have a long period of time to sort of go from place to place, but actually travel and stop along the way. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, that is what I do find is the trains in the Baltic are different to the trains, say Georgia, where we went to Georgia and man, the way they built the train, it was how fast can we make this train go without it falling off the track?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, high-speed rail network is transformative, particularly for a region like the Baltic. But inflation in that region has come down, but remains stubbornly high. Estonia is in recession right now, and while wages are increasing, that creates its own problems, not because it's due to increased productivity, but because of high inflation. So for all of these reasons, the economic situation in the Baltic remains really difficult. The border between Belarus and Lithuania is closing. The other border crossings in that region will be closing soon as well. That reduces the amount of trade that can be put through those regions. It's been shown that the ports in sort of Klaipeda are unable to maintain the volume of export for things like Ukrainian wheat exports and sunflower. So there is capacity constraints in the Baltic economy, and there is high inflation and a continued exodus of young people. So for all of those reasons, The situation presently is quite dire. Add to that we're at the other end of a significant housing boom in those areas. Latvia lagged a little bit behind, but Estonia and Lithuania for several years in a row experienced massive year-on-year house price increases, which means that the people that do have large mortgages in those areas are facing significant cost of living pressures as interest rates continue to rise and energy costs have remained stubbornly high. So it's a difficult time to be in the Baltic, and the fact that they continue to provide more than any other support for Ukraine and Ukraine's effort to fight the Russian Federation. So, a lot of their disposable income that they would otherwise put into investing in their roads and their education is now being spent on weapons to send to Ukraine to help them fight the invasion. So,
oh my God, everything you're describing makes me wonder any young people want to go back to the Baltic. I just...
Well, I mean, the argument would be that it's not that much better elsewhere, and also there is huge opportunities in these areas.
There is. Yeah.
The prospects, the long-term prospects, if you're to get in now and invest locally, is exceedingly good because the populace is extremely well educated, the technology is extremely high, the government corruption levels are, I know a lot of people there would disagree, but are actually quite low, and the tax system, the immigration system, all of that is fairly favourable for business. And if you...
Yeah, you can start a business in a few minutes, all online.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can absolutely do well in the Baltic countries. And I actually think that the tourist sector is going to just explode one day. I mean, one of the things that is going to happen is that one day people are going to discover the Baltic. And how that happens and the way it's managed is critical, because the very thing that people will love about the Baltic could ultimately be destroyed by too many tourists. That said, if done in the right way, it can be a tremendous economic boost for the entire region, because the Baltic countries are absolutely stunning. They have the best food, the best environment, the best people, and with the new infrastructure, new rail infrastructure, new air freight, the hotels, the tourist kind of operators, they could all experience a huge renaissance. And then, of course, Lithuanian goods and services. Their food is very fresh, and it can be exported not just to the EU but further abroad. And that's something that the Baltic countries should really be looking to take advantage of as their newfound friends in Asia. There is a strong interest in the Baltic in much of Asia now.
I saw more Asian people when I was in the Baltic.
Yeah, it's the numbers increasing, and it's, I think, in part simply because they know about it now. I mean, the thing that when I read the Asia Pacific strategy written by the Lithuanian government was that they were lamenting the lack of literacy about Lithuania among Asian countries. But I mean, the population of the Asian region is extraordinary. If you were to draw a circle between Japan and India and just everything in between those two countries, that's more than half the world's population, right? So, and it's the fastest increasing as well. And thus, if you have people, instead of flying to Paris, they fly to Tallinn, which is entirely possible. Like, I don't think there is any intrinsic reason why that shouldn't happen. Then the boom potential for the Baltic region is enormous. And that's just one sector. That's not even talking about technology, services, finance, even resources.
We need, like, Ganymedes Tower to be like the Eiffel Tower. Like, I want that kind of prestige.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of because the gloss has come off Paris.
Yeah, absolutely. But then that's the one thing that I loved when I travelled in Baltic during the summertime. Like, we went to Vilnius and Cholet and all these other small towns. And what I found was food was like it was cooked at home. And I realised it's because everybody working there are Lithuanian, are local people. They're not immigrants. Because unfortunately, when cities get too big, you're going to get more immigration, and therefore those immigrants will take local jobs and it just becomes inauthentic. And you still kind of get that authentic experience. So I don't know. I want the Baltic to thrive. I want to get all the tourist dollars as well, but then I also don't want it to lose its charm of just how authentic it is.
Yeah, and that's the great challenge. Now, it's a good problem to have if you're faced with a boom of tourists and how to make sure you preserve the natural wonder that is the Baltic region. As for immigration, I'm not as concerned because the Baltic region, Poland, that whole area has a different view of immigration. It's entirely possible to immigrate to those countries, but you have to assimilate into the culture. Like, for example, in Lithuania, if you want to become a Lithuanian citizen, you have to pass a citizenship test that's in Lithuanian, right?
Yeah, you have to know Lithuanian.
Yeah, and that means that you've actually invested the time necessary. You're not just there to get EU membership. You're not there just because of the visa advantages. You're there because you actually like Lithuania and you invest your effort in achieving that. The Estonians have a kind of digital nomad program, but that's temporary. That's to encourage business investment, which again is a different type of immigration. And so I don't worry about that as much. I think there is an awareness that they have a sacred duty to preserve their unique identity. There's not that many Latvian speakers in the world, and therefore it's critical to preserve that uniqueness within that region that is Latvia. And therefore, it's a danger. And I think people look at what happened in Sweden, and I think if people are being sober about it, Sweden went too far with immigration, and it's a country of 10 million people, more people in Sweden than the entirety of the Baltic. And if you compare Sweden with Finland, Finland clearly still has a hardcore Scandinavian identity. You go to Helsinki, you go around Finland, and you are in Nordic land, right? Yeah. Whereas in Sweden, it is far more cosmopolitan. That's something that many of the Swedes like about Sweden. They kind of like the fact that they've got, they're a city of the world, Stockholm, and that they've got people from all walks of life. But it went too far, and now they've got a significant amount of social problems. They have real difficulty providing services to all the different types of people. Crime is on the rise, education levels are dropping, and social cohesion is undermined, and their unique identity is being lost. is in real danger. And I think other countries around that part of the world look at that with trepidation. The exception, of course, is the Ukrainian refugees, which is entirely appropriate. The 90% of Ukrainian refugees are women and children. That's a completely different issue, and it accords with the UN Conventions on Refugees, which is that what happens if you're escaping a war zone is you find the closest port that will provide you safe harbour, and you stay there. And that's what has happened in Poland, in Romania, and the whole of the EU has backed them up with additional services. So I don't fear for the Baltic countries in the same way when it comes to that, but I do fear the cheapening of those countries through mass tourism. So you go to those touristed areas where there are all the tourist traps and they get sold all the junky souvenirs. And
here's a magnet from made in China.
And everything's overpriced and the food is all samey. And that could happen, but we're a long way off from that. And once the tourism swells in that region, and then as it should, like everyone should absolutely go there, I think it'll be handled in there'll be an opportunity at least to handle it in an appropriate way. But the primary goal right now, if you can do nothing else with iron focus, is to attract young Baltic people home. The governments of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia should have almost no other objective other than that. And I see some politicians kind of justifying the shift, being like, it's people's free will and people are just exercising their rights under the EU and so on.
No.
Yes, but no.
Yes, but no. I agree. Like, if young people have a good reason to come back, they will come home.
Yeah.
Like, I think all young people like to be home. Like, they're all their families, their upbringing, their like identity as well is important. So, and the fact that they want to have positive impact on the world. Like, many young people are very positive in their mindset. And I think we need to bring the youth back to the Baltic. So, 100%, just focus on young people. I don't know what kind of incentive programs there are. Like scholarships, job opportunities, the whole works, I guess.
Everything.
Yeah, everything. Cool. Affordable housing. Yeah, everything. Everything. Great. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Any questions, feedback, leave them down below. I know it's been a while, but we've definitely missed you guys. We do have things in the pipeline, but we've got other projects, like we mentioned earlier, also on the rolls. So we'll also keep those information down below. I'm going to follow along that kind of journey. But anyways, stay safe and
Ciao for now.